everyone! I've had a lot of questions lately about the long stitches and the back stitches used in part 1 of the Frankenstein SAL. So I thought I would go ahead and give a quick little tutorial and discussion on how I used these stitches in part 1. I'm also going to go over the couching method, which I mentioned in one of my posts. It is going to be used in part 2 of this SAL. So if you're somebody who was curious about what I meant about couching, you can stick around, maybe fast forward through the first part of this video if you don't need the long stitches in the backstitching tutorial, because I am going to go over couching in this video, so stick around for that. All right, let's go ahead and get into it, shall we? Okay, so you can see that I have the Frankenstein SAL in front of me here. Most of it is covered up because I have underneath this piece of paper the full and completed Frankenstein SAL. So I had to do what I could to cover up the parts that you have not seen yet so as not to spoil the surprise. But the lettering Frankenstein would run through here, and then the outer borders. And of course, these are the first two blocks for part 1. So we do have a lot of stitchers, or at least several stitchers, who are brand new to cross stitch. This might be their very first time cross stitching ever. So there have been understandably some questions about the long stitches and back stitches happening within this part 1 of the SAL. So if you are new to cross stitch, you may have been confused in this part by the straight lines that you see in some of these blocks. You know, the cross stitches are all represented by the symbols within the pattern, but then you have just these straight lines throughout the pattern, like here on the ship and even in the little star and in the window panes, and you may have been wondering what you're supposed to do with that. So these are long stitches and back stitches. I'm going to show you how to do both of these kinds of stitches. But let me just first say, even if you are an experienced stitcher, if you have already completed these two blocks and you watch this and you find out that I did something differently than you, don't feel like you need to go back and take it out and redo it unless you want to, unless you feel like the change is needed or wanted in your stitching. I did really leave it up just to your interpretation as to how to complete these stitches. So don't feel like you need to change it if we did something differently. So first of all, let me just say what is what here. So in the house block, the raindrops, the falling rain, these are all long stitches, as is the, I guess this would be called the rigging or something on the ship, these lines on the ship, and the star. Those are all long stitches. The window panes, however, I stitched as back stitches. I have seen quite a few people actually who have completed those as long stitches as well as the rain. Again, don't feel like you need to take those out and change them to back stitches. That's just what I preferred to do there. I felt like it gave it a little cleaner of a look because so many of these, you know, these lines are so close together. I felt like doing back stitching there would make it a little cleaner, but I've seen a lot of your pictures online with those done as long stitches and it looks great as well. So again, don't feel like you need to change that, or going forward, if you want to just do those as long stitches, you can. So what's the difference between back stitching and long stitches? Well, as you can see, the long stitches, you might be able to see it best on the ship because this is probably the longest one. These are one continuous strand of floss. So you can see I can move this around because it is just one single strand going straight through. It's not pinned down at all. It's just starts here and it ends here. So it's kind of loose. You can move them around. Whereas in the window panes, this is true back stitching. These are long stitches. So this is true back stitching. And back stitching is different because even though, you know, the lines in the window panes, you can see they stretch several stitches down, but instead of just stretching it across like this, one strand all the way through the window, these go through every single hole of the fabric. Okay? That probably didn't make a lot of sense to you if you're a brand new cross stitcher. So let me grab some fabric and show you what I'm talking about. Okay, so I have some Ada here, which is going to be easier for beginners to learn on regardless of the stitches, cross stitches, long stitches, back stitching. Ada is much easier than this is in even weave, so it's going to be a lot easier to see on the Ada. I went ahead and I put in a few cross stitches. An important rule of thumb for any pattern that you do in the future, if there's back stitching or long stitching involved in the pattern, general rule of thumb is to complete all of the cross stitching before you do the back stitching. The back stitching should always be the last thing that you do because it's meant to kind of go over the cross stitches. So I added a few cross stitches to my fabric because I need a place to anchor my floss into. I think for the house, for the house block for the rain, I anchored into the border up above it. You can, for the window panes, you can anchor into the house, you can anchor into the ship, but you need a place to anchor because with back stitching, you typically only use one strand of floss rather than two. So for the cross stitching, I used 2 strands of floss, but the back stitching, unless otherwise noted on a pattern, you typically only use 1 strand of floss for back stitching. I do have some patterns in my Etsy shop that use 2 strands. Sometimes I like 2 strands for backstitch lettering, just to make it a little bolder, but usually it's only 1 strand of floss unless noted in the pattern. So for this pattern, it is only 1 strand of floss. I have seen some stitchers use 2 in photos, and again, they look great. It gets up to your interpretation, whatever you want to do with it. But I did use 1 strand of floss. So because I'm only using 1 strand of floss, I needed something to anchor into again, so I put a few cross stitches in here, and I am just going to anchor my floss in the same way that I would end my floss when I'm cross stitching. And usually when I anchor a single strand of floss, say for back stitching, I usually anchor into a few more cross stitches than I would. Like when I'm anchoring my ending floss for cross stitching, I usually only go under maybe 3 stitches, but here I went under 5 stitches just because that single strand is so much thinner, it's much easier to pull out. So I like to anchor in a few more stitches than I normally would. So now I'm just going to return to the front of the fabric. And let's start with the long stitches because quite frankly they're just way easier. They're very simple actually. The hardest part about long stitches is just the counting and figuring out exactly where you're supposed to put the stitches. But long stitches are simply going up in one place and then stretching the floss over to where it ends and putting the needle down. So I don't have the Frankenstein pattern right in front of me, so I'm just going to do random stitches on here, but similar to this. So what you see me making on this fabric is not going to be an exact replica of this. I'm just giving random examples on here. So, okay, let's say that my first one, let's say that we're doing this first raindrop right here. And so to do these long stitches, I'm simply going to come up. Let's say this is where my first one starts. I'm just going to come up, and I always want to be careful on this first one that I'm not pulling my floss out of the anchor there. So I've come up, and let's say on the pattern that it goes over 2 stitches and then down, I don't know, like 5 stitches or so. So I'm going to put my needle in where on the pattern it says the floss is supposed to go, and then I'm just going to pull it through. And that's a long stitch. And you can keep going. You don't have to start, a new strand of floss every time. Let's say the next one is here, and let's say on the pattern it says that it stretches down to here. Obviously, you're going to be going a lot slower because you are going to be actually counting on the pattern and the fabric where they go. But these are long stitches, and they're really quite simple to do. Again, the hardest part is just counting on your fabric where the stitches actually need to go. Now, they don't necessarily always go diagonally. In the star, as you can see, these are just vertical and horizontal, so long stitches can go, with the fabric. These are called long stitches because, again, we're just skipping over the fabric the entire length of that line on the fabric or on the pattern. So these are long stitches too. They don't have to be diagonal, they can be any direction, just so long as it's one continuous strand. Sorry, I keep catching on things. Here we go. So these are all long stitches. It's as simple as that. Backstitching, on the other hand, again, I used backstitching for the window panes. And again, the reason why I used backstitching instead of long stitches in the window panes is because they were just so close together and they cross over each other. And so I felt like it would be neater in the long run to have them all pinned down as backstitches rather than as long stitches. So the difference with backstitching is, again, for these, we jumped across all these, stitching places in our fabric. We just did one continuous strand. We didn't stop, even on the ones that run with the fabric vertically and horizontally. Backstitching, however, if we were going to do this exact same stitch but in backstitching, we would go through every single hole along the way. And we would be doing it, the reason why it's called backstitching is because we do it in sort of a backwards motion. So let's start where we started on this one before. We're starting in the same place. And I'm going to come up, but instead of coming all the way over, I'm going to go to just the very next hole. And I'm going to go down. Now to keep going, I'm going to come over and I'm going to go up through the next hole in the row, the very next hole in the row. I'm going to pull the floss up, and now this is why it's called backstitching. I'm going to go backwards along our line to connect it with that first stitch. Then I'm going to go to the next open hole. And pull up, and again, now I'm going to go backwards to go down and connect through the stitch we just finished. And I'm just going to keep doing this all the way across until I've completed that whole row. So again, it's up to you on any pattern you stitch, it's up to you on whether you do long stitches or backstitching. Now you know that you have to make a long stitch as opposed to backstitching, typically diagonals. Now if it's a single step diagonal, you can do that in backstitching, but really long drawn out diagonals are typically always long stitches because they don't go perfectly through all of those holes. If it's in a straight line, it does, but the diagonals, as you can see, the diagonals, they don't catch every hole along the way. Sometimes the floss, if it's going in a straight line, goes in the middle of one of these stitching places. So you can't comfortably backstitch that line. That's why you would make it a long stitch as opposed to backstitching. So I've completed that whole exact same stitch in backstitching instead of a long stitch. And there is a visible difference. You can see they look different, right? And again, I just used the backstitching in the window panes because these stitches were so close together, they can kind of get a bit blurred if you did long stitches in there. But again, I've seen a lot of pictures already where people have done long stitches within the window panes and it looks great, there's no need to change it. So if you're just curious as to how I did it, that is backstitching rather than long stitches, but you very well could do long stitches in there if you wanted to. So the last bit that we need to talk about is couching, because that is going to come up in part 2 of this SAL. And couching has to do with long stitches. Again, remember I was saying long stitches typically happen when you need to stretch a line over your fabric and it doesn't meet up perfectly with the holes of your fabric. If you have a long stitch that's extremely long, that means it can get kind of wobbly. Like the ships, these could have almost been couched because I can move these with my fingers. They're long enough that I can kind of move them across the fabric. Couching is just the process of taking long stitches and pinning them down so that they don't move. These were just borderline. I felt like these could have been couched, but they didn't really need to be. They weren't so long that they had to be couched, and I just felt like they were okay as they are. Anything longer than this, I probably would couch so that they don't move around. Again, the raindrops, none of these are couched either, because again, some of them are borderline long enough to be couched, but most of them don't move much when you touch them. In the block that is going to be going down here for part 2, however, we do have some long stitches that are very long. I'm going to say they're probably something like this. And they are vertical. They're perfectly vertical. So when we get to that block, and I will put this in the pattern just to remind everyone, because not everyone will watch this video, I did not use backstitching on these vertical lines in part 2. I did long stitches and couched them. Now you could do backstitching, but it will look different. And I feel like the look of that block, to get the motif to look right, I feel like they need to be long stitches that are couched rather than backstitching. So they're maybe even longer than this. They're very long stitches. And so they're perfectly vertical. You would just, again, start where it tells you to and end where it tells you to. But because it's so long and you don't want this to be able to move around and be all loose and manipulated when you're trying to finish it and it'll catch on things, we want to pin this down so that it can't move anywhere, because there's multiple of these. It's actually, let's see, it's something like this. It's three of these in a row in the pattern. Little tiny sneak peek here. It's part 2. It's 3 long stitches like this in a row. And because they just have the ability to move around and get kind of manipulated and out of place, I decided to couch them. So couching is the pinning down of long stitches. For these, they were long enough that they needed couching, but I decided that they only needed 1 couching per long stitch. If you had a really long stitch that went a very long way, you might want to couch it in several places along the way. But these I decided were long enough or short enough that they really only needed to be couched once. So I couched them right in the center. And couching, so I'm gonna pick approximately the center point, and I'm gonna do this first one here, and I'm gonna come up, and I'm coming up on the left side of the stitch. And I'm gonna come up, and now I'm gonna go on the other side of that stitch, and I'm gonna go through the exact same hole. It's kind of hard to show on camera because this is all so small and dainty. But the floss came up on the left-hand side of the long stitch. And now I've got the needle on the right-hand side. And what's gonna happen when I pull this through is this little loop of floss is now going to pin that in place. And it's barely visible, especially, you know, in the pattern we've got cross stitching around this. You can barely see the pins. And that's the whole point. You want to pin it down with it being hardly visible. So again, I came up on the left side of that center long stitch. And now I'm going to put my needle down on the right side through the exact same hole. And this little loop is going to pin that long stitch in place. And do it again on the last one. Got my needle up on the left side. Now I'm going to put my needle down on the other side through the same hole. And that little loop is going to pin it in place. And now these are much more secure. I can't move these nearly as much. And that is couching. And again, we're going to use that in part 2 of this SAL, so it is a valuable skill to know how to do for other patterns as well. And there you have it. There is long stitches, back stitches, and couching. I hope that that wasn't too confusing for anyone. I find it so difficult to explain processes in words. Sometimes there are just no words to explain what I'm doing. Hopefully being able to see it makes it a little more sense. But if you have any more questions, if anything in this video didn't make sense, please feel free to reach out. I'm sure there are other better videos on YouTube to help you with these processes. I'm sure people have figured out better ways to explain it than I have. But I just wanted to give our Frankenstein SAL participants a little guide as to how I did these stitches. So hopefully now you can complete part 1. All right, everyone, thanks for watching. Thank you so much for participating, and I will be seeing you soon.